Have you ever looked directly into the eyes of someone who completely shattered your world, only to realize that they have absolutely no idea that you are the one holding the matches to burn their empire to the ground? Imagine the exact man who humiliated you, the one who callously threw away years of your unwavering dedication for a fleeting illusion, now desperately begging on his knees. Picture him sweating, his voice trembling, pleading for a life-saving corporate contract from the most ruthless and brilliant investor in the entire country. He truly believes this powerful, unyielding executive is his absolute last hope. What he doesn't know, what his deeply arrogant mind couldn't possibly fathom in a million years, is that the imposing woman sitting across the polished boardroom table, shielded by expensive designer sunglasses and a meticulously crafted fake name, is the very same ex-wife you once dared to look down upon and call useless. Today, you are going to hear a story that goes far beyond a simple, everyday heartbreak. This is a definitive masterclass in survival and reinvention. A narrative about a scorned wife who took the sharpest, most painful pieces of her broken reality and forged them into an unbreakable weapon of absolute empowerment. We have all heard standard tales of moving on and finding peace. But what happens when simply moving on isn't enough to balance the scales of justice? Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt the crushing, suffocating weight of betrayal from someone you built an entire life with, only to realize your only viable option was to completely rewrite your own destiny? If you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you wouldn't amount to anything without someone else holding your hand and validating your existence, you are in exactly the right place. What you are about to discover might surprise you, because this isn't just about a standard physical glow-up, nor is it a classic revenge plot where people scream and throw things in the middle of the street. No, this story is about the lethal, quiet elegance of a mistaken identity. It is about a woman who erased her past, vulnerable self so flawlessly that her own ex-husband couldn't recognize the fierce, independent powerhouse she had become right in front of him. She didn't just change her hair, upgrade her wardrobe, or start going to the gym. She upgraded her entire mindset, stepped into a completely new, untouchable persona, and infiltrated his professional world from the top down. As we dive deep into this intense journey of drama, silent tears, and ultimate triumph, I want you to pay close attention to every meticulously calculated move she makes. This story is living proof that the best, most devastating reaction to a toxic relationship and a brutal betrayal isn't a loud, messy argument, but rather a silent, strategic, and unstoppable ascent to the top. Stay with me until the end of this video, because the way she orchestrates his inevitable downfall using his own blinding greed and massive ego against him is nothing short of cinematic brilliance. You will inevitably feel every single ounce of her initial pain and humiliation, but more importantly, you will feel the exhilarating, deeply satisfying rush of her victory. But before she could confidently sit in the leather chair, dictating the harsh terms of his ruin under a brilliantly stolen identity, she had to endure the darkest, loneliest night of her soul. The extraordinary journey from the invisible, devoted partner to the unstoppable architect of her own justice didn't happen overnight. It started in a place of agonizing despair, in a house that suddenly felt cold, with a devastating discovery that would change the trajectory of her life forever. We all know that chilling silence, that heart-stopping moment when the ground completely disappears beneath your feet, and everything you believe to be true is suddenly revealed as a lie. If this subject resonates with you, or if you have ever found yourself staring at the ashes of your own life wondering how to possibly start over, leave a comment below and tell me what has touched you the most so far. Have you ever had to pull yourself out of a dark place after a betrayal, or had to find your inner warrior when someone you love tried to diminish your worth? I truly want to read your stories, because creating a safe, empowering space for us to share these raw, vulnerable moments is the absolute heartbeat of our community. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people. With this kind of deeply emotional content, by taking just a brief moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You are doing so much more than just supporting my work. You are actively helping to deliver this exact message of hope, fierce resilience, and ultimate justice to someone else out there who might be crying right now, desperately needing a reminder of their own hidden power. Every single like, comment, and subscription serves as a beacon, telling others that they are never alone in their pain and that a phenomenal, earth-shattering comeback is always possible. So, if you are ready to stand with us, hit those buttons, and let's walk through the shadows of her journey together. Because to truly appreciate the breathtaking heights of her calculated vengeance and the brilliant execution of her flawless new identity, we first have to understand the absolute brutality of the day she finally uncovered his darkest secret. To understand the absolute brutality of the day, we have to rewind the tape and look closely at the years that preceded the collapse of her world. For over a decade, she was the quintessential woman in the shadows, while he was out there shaking hands, cutting ribbons, and posing for glossy magazine covers as the visionary entrepreneur of the year. She was the silent, tireless engine keeping his entire machine running. It wasn't just about managing a household. It was about managing him. She was his unpaid therapist, his late-night strategist, and his constant, unwavering safety net. Every single time he stumbled, she was there to catch him and quietly put him back on his feet. When his very first startup almost filed for bankruptcy, who do you think sat at the kitchen table until 4 in the morning, poring over complex spreadsheets, brewing endless pots of coffee, and finding the brilliant financial loopholes that ultimately saved his skin? She did. But when the triumphant press release went out celebrating the company's miraculous recovery and its supposed genius, her name was nowhere to be found. And at the time, she didn't mind. She genuinely believed that his success was their success. That was the tragic beauty of her mindset back then. She operated from a place of pure, unconditional partnership, completely unaware that she was meticulously building an impenetrable castle for a king who would eventually lock her in the darkest dungeon. Think about the sheer magnitude of the daily decisions she made to prioritize his ascent over her own existence. She quietly shelved her own bright ambitions. She had a razor-sharp mind for market analysis and a natural, undeniable instinct for investments. But she voluntarily buried those immense talents to play the role of the perfect, supportive corporate wife. She hosted the tedious, exhausting dinner parties, laughing at the dull, repetitive jokes of his arrogant investors, ensuring every wine glass was perfectly full so he could secure the massive capital he desperately needed. She meticulously ironed his bespoke suits so he could walk into every high-stakes boardroom looking invincible, while she wore the same quiet, heavy exhaustion day in and day out. This is the hidden truth of so many towering, self-made empires. They are rarely built by one solitary genius. They are almost always built on the unseen, uncredited, and relentless labor of a devoted partner who actively sacrifices their own light so the other can shine infinitely brighter. The impact of this kind of continuous self-erasure is profound and devastating. You give a piece of your soul on Monday, another piece of your identity on Tuesday, and by the end of the decade, you look in the mirror and you cannot even recognize the hollow ghost staring back at you. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this isn't merely a story about a bad, unbalanced marriage. This is a profound exploration of how we willingly, almost happily, surrender our personal power in the name of love and loyalty. The journey of the invisible wife is a silent, creeping surrender. It happens in the micro moments. It is in the way she slowly stopped bringing up her own passionate desire to go back to school, to get her master's degree, simply because he was distressed at work and demanded absolute peace and quiet at home. It is in the way she conditioned herself to accept his increasingly dismissive, harsh tone during minor arguments, justifying his cruel behavior by telling herself that he was carrying the massive weight of the company on his broad shoulders. Behind the scenes, The dynamic was quietly turning toxic long before the ultimate explosive betrayal ever occurred. He had systematically and intentionally conditioned her to believe that her only true value lay in her direct utility to him. Whenever she offered a genuinely brilliant business idea or a strategic pivot for his company, he would initially scoff at it, rolling his eyes and calling it naive, only to confidently pitch that exact same idea at his next executive board meeting as his own spontaneous, brilliant epiphany. And she let him do it. She smiled quietly from the sidelines, rationalizing the theft, telling herself that this was simply how a successful marriage worked. She was the deep, hidden roots. He was the magnificent, flowering branches. The roots don't need the sun. They just need to quietly hold the heavy tree up against the wind. Let us really examine the psychology that allows this heartbreaking dynamic to take hold. It is not born of weakness. It is very often born of profound empathy, deep love, and a highly distorted sense of duty. Society frequently romanticizes the woman who stands by her man, through thick and thin, framing this boundless, quiet self-sacrifice as the absolute ultimate virtue. She internalized this harmful narrative completely. I want you to picture a very specific night, about 2 years before the catastrophic, fiery end of their marriage. It was the lavish annual gala for his industry, a glamorous night specifically, meant to celebrate his company's record-breaking, astronomical profits. She spent weeks agonizing over finding the perfect dress, desperately wanting to look like the ideal, beautiful partner for the celebrated man of the hour. But the very second they arrived at the dazzling, crowded ballroom, he immediately dropped her hand. He glided smoothly into the glittering crowd, selfishly basking in the flashing cameras and the fawning adoration of his peers, leaving her to stand awkwardly and alone by the coat check. For agonizing hours, she watched from the lonely periphery as he charmed the entire room, casually flirting with younger, ambitious executives, accepting prestigious awards, and delivering a grandiose speech where he passionately thanked his wealthy investors, his board of directors, and even his personal trainer, but conveniently forgot to mention the loyal woman sitting quietly at table number 4, staring numbly at her untouched dinner, when she quietly, gently, brought it up on the freezing, silent car ride home. He gaslit her masterfully. He told her she was being completely irrational and overly sensitive, that she simply didn't understand the complex, high-pressure dynamics of corporate networking, and that she should just be silently grateful for the luxurious, comfortable lifestyle his extremely hard work provided for her. His hard work. Those 3 specific words were a jagged dagger straight to her chest. It was a terrifying masterclass in emotional manipulation. Over time, these relentless, tiny, daily cuts to her self-esteem compounded into massive psychological wounds. The constant, subtle invalidation fundamentally altered her perception of reality. She began to genuinely doubt her own intelligence and worth. The brilliant, fiery woman who used to dissect complex financial models for absolute fun now nervously second-guessed herself when balancing the simple household grocery budget. This is the truly insidious nature of such a toxic dynamic. The victim is slowly, systematically reprogrammed to firmly believe that their abuser is actually their savior. The profound psychological impact of living inside this distorted, suffocating reality is exactly why the subsequent revelations were so earth-shattering, and why her eventual transformation had to be so radical, so absolute, and so fiercely destructive. The pendulum of her life had been pulled so incredibly far into the dark, heavy territory of submission and silence that when the string finally snapped and it swung back, it was destined to completely shatter absolutely everything in its inevitable path. Comment down below. This makes perfect sense to me. That inevitable path to destruction didn't start with a loud, cinematic explosion or a dramatic public scandal. It started on a completely ordinary, rainy Tuesday afternoon with a forgotten iPad, left carelessly unlocked on the polished kitchen counter. For years, she had respected his privacy, fiercely suppressing the quiet, nagging intuition that something behind the scenes of their supposedly perfect marriage was terribly wrong. She had always brushed off his late nights and secretive phone calls as the necessary burdens of a highly successful entrepreneur. But on that specific day, a glaring notification popped up on the bright screen, and she couldn't look away. It wasn't a vague, suspicious text. It was a detailed, forwarded itinerary for a ridiculously expensive luxury vacation to the Maldives, a romantic, two-week getaway booked specifically to celebrate the upcoming closing of his company's massive corporate merger. The second passenger on that first-class ticket wasn't his devoted wife of 10 years. It was the 26-year-old daughter of his biggest industry rival, a glamorous, highly influential socialite who had recently joined his firm as a strategic consultant. As her violently shaking hand scrolled through months and months of hidden messages, the true, unfiltered horror of the situation paralyzed her entire body. These weren't just the pathetic messages of an older man having this superficial midlife crisis. They were the cold, highly calculated communications of a man entirely replacing his foundational support system with a newer, flashier model. He was actively mocking her to this other woman, and one of the most agonizing exchanges, the new, younger woman joked about having to hide from his boring, hopelessly domesticated wife. And his immediate reply was a laughing emoji followed by the soul-crushing words, "Don't worry about her. She's just a temporary placeholder. Until I officially secure this massive distribution deal with your father." She has no idea what's coming. The sheer, visceral pain of reading those specific words is practically impossible to describe to anyone who hasn't felt it. Every single sacrifice, every sleepless night, every piece of her own soul she had freely given to him to help build his empire was violently reduced to a cruel, pathetic joke and a private text message. She had spent a decade building his heavy golden crown, only to watch him meticulously polish it and place it on someone else's head. When he finally walked through the grand front door that evening, casually tossing his keys on the entryway table and arrogantly asking what was for dinner, she confronted him. She didn't scream uncontrollably. She didn't throw expensive plates against the wall. She simply handed him the glowing iPad, her voice trembling slightly, but her eyes completely dry and wide with shock. And a normal, conventional story. This is the exact moment where the guilty husband drops to his knees, begs for forgiveness, cries crocodile tears, and swears it meant absolutely nothing. But you have to remember the deeply arrogant monster she had unknowingly helped create over the years. He didn't flinch. He didn't look even remotely ashamed. Instead, he slowly looked up from the illuminated screen, let out a heavy, incredibly irritated sigh, and walked calmly over to the custom home bar to pour himself a generous glass of expensive scotch that she had personally bought for him as a gift. What followed was a brutal, systematic dismantling of her entire reality. He didn't offer a single word of apology. Instead, he aggressively attacked her with an icy, terrifying calmness. He looked her up and down with absolute disgust and delivered the sharp words that would haunt her nightmares for months. "Let's be completely honest here. Since we are finally laying everything out on the table," he sneered, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. "You really thought a man in my current position, dealing with the kind of high-stakes, multi-million-dollar decisions I make every single day, was going to spend the rest of his life with a glorified housekeeper? You don't understand the first thing about real business. You don't understand the global market. You don't have the necessary high society connections. And let's face the harsh reality. You are absolutely nothing without my name attached to yours." He ruthlessly told her that his new partner was a modern woman of the future, someone who actually brought real, tangible power and influence to the table, not just flawlessly ironed shirts and polite, empty smiles at boring corporate dinners. The sheer injustice of that moment was physically suffocating. This was the exact same man who used to cry uncontrollably in her arms, when his early bank accounts were completely empty and his creditors were calling. This was the man whose very first viable business plan was physically typed by her own exhausted hands at 3 in the morning. And now, standing in the middle of a breathtaking multi-million-dollar mansion that her unseen, uncredited labor had fundamentally paid for, he was looking at her like she was an irritating, worthless beggar who had accidentally wandered in off the street. He didn't just break her loyal heart. He actively and intentionally sought to destroy her entire sense of self-worth. He gave her exactly 48 hours to pack her personal belongings and vacate the sprawling property, coldly informing her that his ruthless team of corporate lawyers had already drawn up airtight divorce papers that would leave her with the absolute bare minimum legally possible. He was throwing her away with the exact same casual, heartless indifference one might have when discarding an old, outdated piece of office furniture that no longer matched the modern aesthetic. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the intense psychological warfare happening in this specific dynamic is absolutely crucial to understand. When a highly toxic, narcissistic person finally decides to discard you, they rarely just pack their bags and respectfully walk away. They feel an intense, overwhelming, almost pathological need to burn your entire confidence to ash before they close the door behind them. Why did they do this? Because the hidden truth of the situation is that he knew, deep down in his hollow, insecure core, exactly how brilliant, resilient, and inherently capable she actually was. He knew that the only possible way he could safely abandon her and steal everything they built together without risking a massive legal and public fight was to completely shatter her mindset. If he could successfully convince her that she was utterly stupid, completely useless, and entirely dependent on his wealth, she would be too paralyzed by fear and overwhelming self-doubt to stand up and demand what was rightfully hers. The profound impact of his calculated cruelty was specifically designed to keep her small, to ensure she would quietly, obediently fade away into the invisible background while he proudly paraded his new, shiny, influential life in front of the entire world. He desperately wanted her to believe that her life was entirely over. He wanted her to feel the crushing, unbearable weight of public humiliation when the vicious tabloids eventually leaked the juicy story of the powerful, visionary CEO trading in his plain, boring wife for a wealthy, stunning heiress. The sheer arrogance of his brutal actions was meant to be the absolute final nail in the coffin of her personal identity, and for a brief, terrifying, agonizing moment, his cruel, calculated strategy actually worked, as she stood alone in the center of their massive, luxurious master bedroom, mindlessly folding the few basic sweaters she was actually allowed to take with her. The heavy tears finally came. They weren't just standard tears of heartbreak over a lost romance. They were hot, stinging tears of profound, agonizing humiliation and a deep, burning shame for having been so blindly, deeply foolish for over a decade. She felt entirely hollowed out, entirely defeated, and entirely alone in a world that suddenly made absolutely no sense. With trembling hands, she dragged her heavy suitcases down the grand, sweeping staircase of the beautiful home she had painstakingly decorated, past the heavy, imposing oak front doors, and out into the freezing, unforgiving night air. As she loaded her bags into the dusty back seat of a cheap, anonymous taxi, she looked back at the glowing, warm windows of the mansion one last time. He was already upstairs, probably laughing on the phone with his new lover, completely unbothered by the undeniable fact that he had just violently destroyed a human life. He truly thought he had decisively, permanently won the war. He firmly believed he had buried her so deep in the dark dirt of her own absolute despair that she would never, ever find the strength to claw her way back to the surface. But the fatal, blinding flaw of deeply arrogant, narcissistic men is that they never understand the fundamental, powerful difference between burying a corpse and planting the seed. He honestly thought he had permanently extinguished her inner light, completely unaware that he had just knowingly handed her the very match she needed to start an unstoppable, all-consuming inferno. The horrific revelations of the dark night were merely the painful, necessary catalyst for an incredible journey of transformation she never asked for, but one she was absolutely destined to conquer with a vengeance. Write in the comments, I feel this injustice too. The taxi dropped her off at a cheap, dimly lit motel on the absolute outskirts of the city, a place so incredibly far removed from her previous life of breathtaking luxury that it felt like landing on an entirely different, hostile planet. The small, dingy room smelled faintly of harsh bleach and old, stale cigarettes, while the aggressively flickering neon sign outside cast long, distorted, almost mocking shadows across the peeling floral wallpaper. As she slowly sat on the edge of the incredibly uncomfortable, sagging mattress, the deafening, heavy silence of the isolated room finally broke the massive emotional dam she had been desperately holding up ever since she discovered the damning, glowing iPad. She didn't just casually cry. She physically and spiritually shattered into a million jagged pieces. She curled into a tight, trembling ball on the cold floor, weeping with a visceral, agonizing intensity that violently ripped through her throat and burned her chest. She aggressively grieved for the entire decade of her vibrant youth she had so freely and generously given away. She deeply mourned the beautiful, quiet future they had vividly planned together, and she shed the bitterest tears for the naive, blindly trusting woman who had effectively died right there in the magnificent marble foyer of their mansion just a few excruciating hours prior. This was the absolute, undeniable rock bottom of suffocating, terrifying dark abyss where the oxygen suddenly feels incredibly thin and the sheer, unbearable weight of absolute betrayal threatens to crush your human spirit completely. For several agonizing hours in the dark, she allowed herself to truly feel every single ounce of the searing pain, the profound, burning humiliation, and the terrifying, paralyzing uncertainty of a future that had been violently erased with a single, cruel conversation. Her phone buzzed relentlessly on the cheap plastic nightstand. It was him, leaving cold, calculated voicemails not to desperately apologize or beg for her forgiveness, but to arrogantly dictate the harsh logistical terms of her immediate financial surrender, aggressively reminding her to sign the divorce papers quickly to avoid causing him any unnecessary and annoying public embarrassment during his massive corporate merger. The blinding, overwhelming urge to aggressively retaliate right then and there was almost physically impossible to resist. Her shaking fingers rapidly typed out dozens of furious, desperate, pleading messages she thankfully never sent. She vividly, passionately imagined driving a car straight back to that sprawling, heavily gated estate, violently throwing heavy rocks through those massive, custom-built windows, and screaming his filthy, hidden secrets to the entire wealthy, judgmental neighborhood. She deeply wanted to call the most ruthless tabloid journalists in the city, expose the sordid, disgusting details of his cliché affair with the rival CEO's young daughter, and gleefully watch the ensuing public relations nightmare completely swallow his pristine, carefully curated reputation whole. Society practically conditions us to expect exactly this kind of explosive, chaotic, and highly destructive reaction from a deeply wronged, heartbroken woman. We are systematically taught that the natural, expected response to a shattered reality is a messy, loud, and incredibly public breakdown. But as she slowly stood up and stared blankly at her swollen, tear-stained face in the cracked, yellowing bathroom mirror, a chillingly calm, incredibly powerful realization began to gently wash over her trembling body. If she threw a massive, predictable public tantrum, if she willingly played the pathetic role of the hysterical, deeply jealous, and unhinged ex-wife, she would be handing him the exact, perfect narrative he desperately needed to justify his profoundly cruel actions to their elite social circle. He would simply shake his perfectly styled head, look at his wealthy peers with a patronizing, fake sympathetic sigh, and smoothly say, "See, I absolutely had to leave her. She is completely unstable and totally out of control." She would be voluntarily giving away the very last precious drop of her own dignity just to make a temporary, meaningless noise in his world. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the incredibly crucial space between the initial, paralyzing shock of a deep trauma and your subsequent, calculated reaction is exactly where your entire future destiny is definitively written. True, unshakable power is rarely loud or chaotic. It is almost always meticulously quiet and profoundly strategic. As the first faint, pale rays of morning light began to slowly filter through the dusty, broken motel blinds, something fundamental and irreversible shifted deep inside her brain. The burning, chaotic, overwhelming sadness that had kept her violently awake all night slowly began to solidify into a very different, far more dangerous and potent emotion. A cold, highly calculated, an absolute resolve. The hot tears simply stopped falling. She carefully washed her face with freezing water, watching the dark, heavy mascara run down the rusty drain, and with it went the fragile, accommodating, eternally invisible wife she used to be. The hidden truth about violently hitting rock bottom is that once you actually survive the terrifying, breathless fall, the hard, unforgiving ground beneath you instantly becomes the most solid, dependable foundation you have ever stood on. She realized, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that the most devastating, earth-shattering revenge she could possibly inflict upon a deeply narcissistic man, whose entire existence was built on a massive, highly fragile ego, wasn't a screaming match in the middle of a public street. It was her own unapologetic, astronomical, and blinding success. The profound impact of this single, brilliant realization was utterly electric and entirely life-changing. She implicitly understood that fighting him in the messy, emotional mud would only make her dirty while ironically keeping him highly relevant and centered in her life. Instead, she consciously chose the absolute highest, most difficult road, not out of a sense of gentle forgiveness or spiritual peace, but out of sheer, brilliant, aggressive strategy. She desperately needed to disappear completely from his arrogant radar. She would let him arrogantly think she was permanently broken. She would let him firmly, confidently believe she was quietly sobbing in a dark corner, entirely defeated by his perceived intellectual and financial superiority. His blinding, unchecked arrogance was undeniably his absolute greatest weakness, and her sudden, absolute, deafening silence would become her ultimate, impenetrable camouflage. The behind the scenes of her incredible journey was about to officially begin, and it required absolute, unbreakable discipline and focus. She wasn't just loosely planning to eventually move on with her life and find a new hobby. She was meticulously preparing to orchestrate an absolute masterpiece of brutal, poetic justice. The shocking revelation she experienced in that cheap, forgotten motel room fundamentally and permanently rewired her entire mindset. She saw with absolute, crystal clear precision that he had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation when he callously threw her away. He had greedily stolen the heavy financial assets and the shiny social status, yes, but he had carelessly, foolishly left her with the most valuable, destructive weapon of all, the deep, intimate, encyclopedic knowledge of exactly how his entire corporate empire actually operated behind closed doors. After all, she was the brilliant, uncredited mind who had quietly drafted the foundational architectural plans for his entire fragile castle in the very first place. She slowly sat down at the small, rickety wooden desk, opened a cheap, lined notepad she found buried in the drawer, and grabbed a pen. But she wasn't writing angry, emotional letters or drafting pathetic, desperate pleas for him to realize his mistake and come back home. She was aggressively outlining a ferocious, brilliant, and deeply complex multi-year business plan. Every single one of her critical decisions from that bright morning forward was entirely driven by an unquenchable, burning thirst to completely reclaim her stolen power and identity. This wasn't just a basic, superficial transformation where she changed her hair color and went to the gym. It was a complete, systematic, and terrifying resurrection of her true potential. She was going to methodically become the exact type of terrifying, unstoppable force of nature that a small, insecure man like him could never even begin to comprehend, let alone successfully defeat in a boardroom. She quietly packed her few, meager, folded belongings, confidently walked out of the depressing motel room, and stepped into the crisp, biting morning air not as a tragic, broken victim, but as the brilliant, highly dangerous architect of her own incredible destiny. She knew the long road ahead would be brutally exhausting, requiring unimaginable personal sacrifice and an unbreakable, almost obsessive focus. But the massive, roaring fire now burning quietly in her chest was entirely inextinguishable. The quiet, submissive, invisible wife was permanently dead and buried in the ashes of yesterday. And what was about to powerfully rise from her heavy smoke would fundamentally change the financial and personal landscape of his entire world. Comment down below. I am taking my power back. The first step of this monumental journey didn't involve glamorous shopping sprees or walking into a high-end salon. It started in a tiny, sparsely furnished studio apartment she rented on the absolute opposite side of the city, miles away from the wealthy, manicured bubble she used to blindly call home. She took the modest savings she had managed to quietly set aside over the years, a small financial cushion she once naively thought might go toward a family vacation or a rainy day, and made the most critical, life-altering choice of her entire existence. She didn't buy a new car. She didn't book an expensive yoga retreat to find herself. And she certainly didn't spend a single cent on anything that wouldn't directly serve her ultimate, burning goal. Instead, she treated that small bank account as the absolute initial seed capital for the most important startup in the world, the complete reinvention of her own life. The behind the scenes of those first few months would have easily broken a lesser person. She vanished entirely from all social media, completely changed her phone number, and effectively became a ghost to everyone who ever knew the old, submissive version of her. Her small dining table became a chaotic, brilliant war room, covered entirely in towering stacks of complex financial reports, dense market analysis charts, and obscure industry forecasts. She wasn't just casually reading about business to pass the time. She was obsessively dissecting the exact, highly competitive niche her ex-husband arrogantly dominated. She knew his company's polished public face better than anyone, but now she was digging aggressively into the raw, unfiltered data, actively looking for the tiny, hidden cracks in his armor. She tirelessly studied global supply chains, international trade laws, and aggressive investment strategies until her eyes burned and the morning sun came up. The hidden truth about true mastery is that it absolutely requires an almost terrifying level of isolation and unwavering focus. She realized that to completely destroy him and his own arena, she couldn't just be as smart as him. She had to be infinitely smarter, 10 times faster, and entirely devoid of the emotional blind spots that plague his deeply arrogant decision-making. Every single night, while he was out clinking expensive champagne glasses with his new, younger girlfriend, blindly celebrating his supposed invincibility, she was sitting under a cheap, flickering desk lamp, specifically memorizing the exact vulnerabilities of his primary suppliers and identifying the massive, highly risky financial gaps his reckless corporate expansion had secretly created. The sheer volume of knowledge she consumed during this intense period of isolation was staggering. The revelations she uncovered about his fragile business model were both shocking and incredibly empowering. She saw, with cold, mathematical precision, exactly how heavily his entire empire relied on aggressive, short-term debt and the highly fickle loyalty of a few key investors. He was driving a multi-million-dollar sports car at top speed on a road entirely made of thin ice. And she was meticulously drafting the exact blueprint of how to gracefully break that ice right out from under him. But absolute intellectual superiority was only one half of the complex equation she needed to solve. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the mental architecture required for this level of reinvention is absolutely fascinating. When we talk about a glow-up, society usually reduces it to a superficial, basic montage of gem selfies, a new makeup routine, and a revenge dress. But that is a profound misunderstanding of what a genuine, earth-shattering transformation actually requires. A true metamorphosis is fundamentally born from a radical shift in mindset. Every single one of her decisions during this grueling period was highly calculated to violently sever any remaining psychological ties to the weak, invisible woman she used to be. You cannot step into a magnificent, powerful new future while still comfortably wearing the heavy, restrictive clothes of your traumatic past. She implicitly understood that her external appearance had to perfectly mirror the lethal, unyielding intelligence she was actively cultivating in her mind. The physical change wasn't about looking conventionally attractive to make him jealous. It was about aggressively forging an impenetrable, terrifying suit of armor. It was about creating a physical presence so commanding, so inherently intimidating, that it would completely short-circuit the brain of anyone who dared to underestimate her or look down upon her ever again. The day she finally walked into the city's most exclusive, discreet salon, she didn't nervously ask for a simple trim. She looked the high-end stylist dead in the eye and ordered him to aggressively cut away years of the soft, long hair that her ex-husband had always rigidly demanded she keep. As the long, heavy locks fell to the pristine marble floor, she felt a profound, almost physical lightness wash over her entire body. She purposefully traded the soft, accommodating pastel colors and conservative, blending in the background dresses of her former life for a breathtaking, razor-sharp wardrobe. She invested heavily in impeccably tailored, dark designer suits that fit her like a second skin, structured blazers with sharp shoulders that screamed absolute authority, and sleek, minimalist accessories that projected a cold, untouchable elegance. But the most significant, impactful change couldn't be bought in any luxury boutique on earth. It was the fundamental, radical shift in her posture. She spent countless hours standing in front of the full-length mirror in her tiny apartment, aggressively training her own body language. She practiced standing with her shoulders forcefully pushed back, her chin slightly elevated, and her gaze dead set and completely unwavering. She actively and consciously learned the subtle, apologetic mannerisms of the devoted wife, the nervous smiling, the constant, agreeable nodding, the instinctual shrinking of her own physical space to accommodate the massive egos of the men around her. The sheer impact of this meticulous, grueling preparation was absolutely breathtaking. When she finally looked in the mirror at the end of those silent, agonizing months, the powerful woman staring back at her was entirely unrecognizable. Gone forever was the exhausted, anxious, deeply insecure partner who used to nervously wait by the door for a tiny scrap of affection. In her place stood a terrifyingly calm, wildly sophisticated, and undeniably lethal executive. She had successfully weaponized her own grief, turning every single ounce of her deep humiliation into a high-octane fuel that propelled her relentlessly toward absolute excellence. This arduous, invisible journey through the shadows had forged her fragile spirit into pure, unbreakable titanium. She had masterfully studied his exact corporate moves, fluently learned his complex financial language, and physically transformed herself into the absolute embodiment of his worst, most paralyzing corporate nightmare. She was no longer just a sad, scorned ex-wife seeking petty, meaningless revenge. She was a highly trained, fully armed apex predator patiently circling the outer perimeter of his incredibly fragile territory. And as she finally packed her sleek leather briefcase with the devastating financial traps she had spent months carefully designing, she knew with absolute, chilling certainty that she was perfectly ready to step back out into the blinding light. She was ready to introduce the high-stakes business world and, most importantly, him to a completely new, unstoppable force of nature, setting the stage for a game of high-level deception that his arrogant mind could never possibly anticipate. Comment down below. I am ready for my own transformation. The brutal reality she faced was that, no matter how brilliant her newly constructed financial models were, or how flawlessly sharp her sophisticated new wardrobe looked, her ex-husband's staggering, unchecked narcissism would absolutely prevent him from ever sitting respectfully across a negotiating table from the woman he had so viciously discarded. He would instinctively dismiss her, laugh her out of the corporate building, and ruthlessly use his massive, expensive legal team to crush her new ventures simply out of spite and deeply ingrained arrogance. She knew this hidden truth about his massive ego and profound insecurities better than anyone alive. Therefore, merely showing up as a highly upgraded, successful version of his ex-wife would be a fatal, amateur tactical error. She didn't just need a brand new look, she desperately needed an entirely new, untraceable existence. She needed a phantom identity, a powerful corporate ghost that carried immense, undeniable financial weight, but had absolutely zero verifiable ties to her personal history. This is exactly where the sheer, breathtaking genius of her revenge plan truly took flight. Over the course of several highly secretive, grueling months, working closely with discreet offshore attorneys and brilliant, international financial fixers, she systematically built a completely impenetrable labyrinth of complex shell corporations. She funneled her initial, hard-earned investments through a labyrinthine series of European holdings, eventually establishing a highly exclusive, formidable private equity fund supposedly based out of Switzerland. The behind-the-scenes of this intricate corporate structuring was an absolute masterclass in modern financial warfare and legal obscurity. By the time the ink finally dried on the last set of international incorporation documents, she was no longer the abandoned, humiliated wife from the quiet suburbs. On paper, and in the highly insulated, ruthless world of elite corporate finance, she had officially become the enigmatic and fiercely intimidating senior partner. Known only as Ms. V, creating the complex legal paperwork was only the first logistical step of this monumental journey. The true, terrifying challenge lay in the physical and psychological execution of this newly forged identity. To successfully pull off the ultimate, high-stakes plot twist in an unforgiving corporate environment, she had to become a completely unrecognizable entity, so fundamentally different from her past self that even a man who had shared her home for a decade wouldn't feel the absolute slightest tremor of familiarity. She hired a highly specialized, expensive vocal coach not to learn how to sing, but to completely reconstruct her cadence, her pitch, and her natural accent. The soft, accommodating, slightly hesitant voice of the devoted housewife was painstakingly and aggressively erased. In its place, she carefully cultivated a rich, commanding, and icy European ting baritone, speaking with the slow, highly deliberate rhythm of a person who implicitly knows their time is worth thousands of dollars. A minute, she radically changed, her signature scent permanently replacing the sweet, generic floral perfumes he used to casually buy for her with a heavy, complex, and deeply intimidating custom fragrance built on notes of rich leather, dark wood, and cold amber. She began wearing oversized, incredibly expensive designer sunglasses indoors, a classic, unapologetic power move that not only physically obscured the recognizable shape of her eyes, but also projected an impenetrable aura of absolute, untouchable mystery. Every single one of her decisions regarding this brilliant disguise was meticulously calculated to establish overwhelming authority from the very first second she entered a room. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the psychology behind adopting a powerful alter ego is a fascinating exploration of human potential. When you put on a metaphorical mask that aggressively demands absolute respect, your brain actually begins to wire itself to comfortably inhabit that elevated status. The incredible transformation she underwent wasn't just a clever theatrical performance. To trick an arrogant man, it fundamentally altered her core mentality. As Miss V, she wasn't weighed down by the agonizing, heavy baggage of her past trauma. Miss V didn't cry over shattered marriages in cheap motel rooms. And Miss V certainly didn't feel insecure about her worth in a boardroom full of men. Miss V was a cold, highly calculating apex predator of the financial world. A terrifying woman who dictated the harsh, unforgiving rules of the game rather than passively, weakly submitting to them. This profound psychological detachment provided her with the ultimate strategic advantage. It allowed her to view her ex-husband not as the terrifying, powerful monster who had viciously destroyed her life, but simply as a highly flawed, over-leveraged, and increasingly desperate target on a massive financial chessboard. The profound revelation she experienced while operating from the secure place of absolute authority were staggering. She realized that corporate power is largely a fragile illusion, a collective agreement based almost entirely on posture, unshakable confidence, and the ruthless control of crucial information. To truly understand the brilliance of her strategy, you have to appreciate the sheer, terrifying audacity it takes to walk directly into the lion's den wearing the skin of an absolute stranger. She didn't just stumble randomly into his corporate radar. She meticulously planted the seeds of her own grand arrival. Operating entirely under the heavily shielded, prestigious umbrella of her Swiss investment firm, she quietly began acquiring massive amounts of distressed debt from the very suppliers his company desperately relied upon to function. She subtly and aggressively choked off his secondary funding avenues, anonymously feeding highly damaging, yet entirely accurate, financial tips to key industry analysts. Slowly but surely, she began to tighten a highly invisible, suffocating noose around his magnificent, towering empire. She was methodically starving his company of vital capital, creating an artificial crisis so severe that his fragile, arrogant mind would violently panic. And when a deeply narcissistic man panics, he makes sloppy, impulsive, and fatal errors. He begins frantically looking for miraculous, overnight salvations. He starts blindly chasing the elusive unicorn investors who can write a massive, blank check to magically solve all of his profound operational failures. He was completely, happily unaware that the severe, terrifying financial drought he was suddenly experiencing wasn't a natural, unpredictable market fluctuation. It was a highly targeted, meticulously engineered corporate siege conducted by the very woman he had so confidently and cruelly discarded. As the suffocating financial pressure mounted, his carefully curated public facade began to crack visibly. The glowing magazine covers abruptly stopped, quickly replaced by aggressive, panicked phone calls from his board of directors demanding immediate, concrete solutions to the bleeding balance sheets. The young, glamorous new partner he had proudly traded her for suddenly found his constant, stress-induced rage and empty bank accounts far less charming than his previous billionaire persona. He was drowning rapidly, thrashing wildly in dark, turbulent waters he could absolutely no longer control. And exactly at the precise moment when his lungs were burning for oxygen, when his massive ego was finally fractured by the terrifying reality of his impending, highly public financial doom, she flawlessly executed the next, brilliant phase of her master plan through a series of highly connected, discreet intermediaries. She allowed a targeted, whispered rumor to reach his desperate ears, a highly secretive, incredibly wealthy foreign investment group led by a ruthless, visionary woman known only as Miss V, was actively looking to aggressively acquire distressed assets in his specific market sector. The bait was set with breathtaking precision. She knew exactly how his greedy, arrogant mind worked. He wouldn't see a brilliantly designed trap. He would only see a golden, glittering lifeline sent straight from the universe, he would aggressively pursue this mysterious investor, entirely convinced that his legendary charm and supposed business genius could easily manipulate this foreign entity into bailing out his rapidly sinking ship. He was sprinting blindly toward a meticulously crafted guillotine, utterly convinced it was the grand entrance to a victory parade. And as she sat in her sleek, dimly lit penthouse office, reviewing the desperate, pleading email his executive assistant had just sent to her heavily encrypted corporate server, a slow, highly dangerous smile finally spread across her face. The trap had been flawlessly sprung, and the devastating game of high-stakes deception was about to enter its most critical, heart-stopping phase. Comment down below. I am taking the control back. The desperation was palpable in the air of his luxurious corporate headquarters. The walls that once echoed with the loud, confident laughter of an untouchable CEO were now suffocatingly silent, heavy with the undeniable stench of impending ruin. The massive cash flow problems hadn't just appeared overnight. They were a slow, agonizing hemorrhage. What he didn't know, and what his highly paid, but painfully incompetent financial advisors completely failed to grasp, was that the massive supply chain disruptions and the sudden withdrawal of his secondary credit lines weren't random strokes of bad market luck. They were the direct result of her meticulously orchestrated maneuvers in the shadows, operating through the heavily fortified walls of her Swiss investment firm. She had systematically cut his vital arteries one by one. His frantic attempts to plug the holes only made the ship sink faster. He was hemorrhaging money on the corporate floor, and his highly publicized relationship with the young heiress was rapidly deteriorating under the immense, crushing weight of his failures. The young woman he had proudly traded his loyal wife for was accustomed to private jets and limitless credit cards, not stress-induced screaming matches and bounce vendor checks. As his personal life crumbled, his professional desperation reached a fever pitch. He desperately needed a savior, a massive influx of capital to maintain the fragile illusion of his success, and he needed it immediately before the entire market realized he was bleeding out. When his executive assistant finally managed to secure a preliminary meeting with the elusive representatives of Miss V's private equity fund, he practically wept with profound relief. He viewed this high-stakes meeting not as a rigorous financial audit, but as a guaranteed, absolute victory. His blinding narcissism firmly convinced him that he could simply walk into the room, flash his signature charismatic smile, weave a few complex corporate lies, and walk out with a massive blank check. He spent hours carefully selecting the perfect bespoke suit, practicing his firm handshake in the mirror, and rehearsing a pitch designed specifically to manipulate a powerful, wealthy foreign woman. He assumed she would be just another board elite he could easily charm and eventually control. The sheer arrogance of his preparation was laughable to anyone who actually knew the hidden truth of the situation. As he finally stepped off the private elevator into the breathtaking, ultra-modern penthouse office she had temporarily leased for this exact encounter, his heart was pounding with greedy, insatiable anticipation. At the far end of the impossibly long, polished obsidian table sat the woman he had thrown away like trash. But he didn't feel even a microscopic flicker of recognition. The transformation was so absolute, so flawlessly executed, that he was simply staring at a terrifying, brilliant stranger. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored dark crimson suit that aggressively commanded the entire room. Large, incredibly expensive designer sunglasses shielded her eyes, reflecting the sparkling city skyline and completely hiding any micro-expressions that might have betrayed her true identity. When she finally spoke, her voice was a rich, icy, European-accented baritone that sent a slight, involuntary shiver down his spine. She didn't stand up to respectfully greet him. She didn't offer a warm, polite smile. She simply gestured to the empty leather chair across the vast table with a single, highly deliberate movement of her manicured hand. The sheer impact of her overwhelming presence immediately threw him entirely off balance. This wasn't a submissive woman he could casually flirt with. This was an apex predator calmly assessing her next meal. Yet, driven by pure, blind greed, he foolishly decided to play his usual, pathetic game. He leaned forward, flashing his bright white teeth, and launched into his heavily rehearsed pitch, attempting to paint a glorious, purely fictional picture of his company's immense future potential, while completely ignoring the catastrophic reality of its present state. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the mindset of a cornered narcissist relies entirely on the desperate illusion of control. When you strip away the massive bank accounts and the shining social status, their entire mental architecture is fundamentally built on their perceived ability to manipulate the reality of the people around them. He was sitting there, boldly lying to her face, painting a vivid picture of minor cash flow hiccups and temporary market adjustments. He used his deepest, most persuasive voice, leaning across the dark table and softening his eyes in a pathetic attempt to manufacture a false intimacy. He dropped hollow corporate buzzwords like synergy, disruption, and unprecedented market capture, attempting to subtly charm the mysterious Miss V into overlooking the glaring, radioactive red flags. In his accounting books, he genuinely believed his raw charisma was working. He had absolutely no idea that she had personally spent the last several grueling months tearing those exact same books apart line by highly manipulated line. She already knew every single dirty secret of his operation. She knew the absolute, unfiltered behind-the-scenes reality of his rotting empire. Listening to him spin his desperate web of lies was an incredible, surreal experience for her. She watched the arrogant man who had once confidently told her she knew absolutely nothing about business now sweat profusely as he tried to explain away massive, gaping holes in his financial strategy to the very woman he had completely underestimated. Every single one of his calculated decisions during that intense meeting was a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was brilliantly leading a foreign investor through a complex negotiation, smoothly guiding her toward a mutually beneficial partnership. In reality, he was a blind rat happily navigating a complex maze specifically designed to lead him straight into a lethal trap. She played her part with terrifying, Oscar-worthy perfection. She occasionally nodded, asking sharp, incredibly precise questions that clearly demonstrated her profound, intimidating knowledge of a specific industry. Her sharp questions were designed not to seek information, but to subtly force him to commit to his desperate lies on the official record. She intentionally let him feel like he was slowly but surely winning her over. She fed his massive, fragile ego, offering small, highly calculated compliments about his supposed visionary leadership, watching with a cold, internal satisfaction as he eagerly swallowed the poison bait whole. The internal revelations happening inside her own mind during this encounter were profoundly empowering. The terrifying monster who had once dictated her entire self-worth was completely gone, effectively replaced by a desperate, sweating, profoundly mediocre man begging for survival. The delicate, dangerous dance continued as he proudly laid out the proposed terms of the investment. He asked for an astronomical sum of capital, offering in return a ridiculously small, non-voting equity stake in his holding company. It was an insulting, delusional offer, completely disconnected from the catastrophic, bleeding reality of his financial situation. A normal investor would have laughed, packed up their briefcase, and immediately walked out of the room. But Miss V wasn't a normal investor, and this wasn't a normal journey. She leaned back in her heavy, high-backed leather chair, steepling her impeccably manicured fingers, and allowed a long, painfully agonizing silence to stretch across the massive room. She let the heavy, suffocating silence press down on his chest until he practically stopped breathing. She knew, from years of painful, intimate experience, that the absolute worst thing you can do to an egomaniac is to withhold immediate, fawning validation. He started fidgeting uncomfortably, nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, his previously confident, winning smile slowly melting into a tight, anxious grimace. The cold sweat began to bead noticeably on his forehead. He was completely trapped in her immense gravitational pull, utterly and helplessly dependent on her very next word. The invisible, discarded wife had successfully lured the arrogant, narcissistic king directly into the absolute dead center of her carefully woven web. And he was so deeply blinded by his own insatiable, toxic greed that he couldn't even feel the thick, unbreakable silk threads wrapping violently tight around his own throat. He truly thought he was brilliantly securing his ultimate legacy, completely oblivious to the terrifying fact that he was enthusiastically, joyfully digging his own deep corporate grave. He was practically begging her to take everything from him, and she was more than ready to hand him the very pen he would use to sign his own spectacular downfall. All that right in the comments, he fell right into the trap. The heavy, suffocating silence in the penthouse office stretched on for what felt like an absolute eternity, pressing down on his chest with the weight of a physical force. He sat there, his perfectly rehearsed smile frozen and straining at the edges, desperately waiting for the mysterious Miss V to validate his delusions of grandeur. When she finally broke the silence, her voice did not carry the warm, enthusiastic approval he was so eagerly anticipating. Instead, it was sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. She calmly leaned forward, resting her forearms on the immaculate obsidian table, and effortlessly dismantled his entire fictional presentation in under 60 seconds. She casually recited the exact, highly confidential debt figures his company was desperately trying to hide, referenced the specific supply chain failures he thought were buried under layers of corporate obfuscation, and accurately named the 3 major investors who had secretly pulled their funding. Just that morning, the hidden truth of his spectacular failure was suddenly dragged out into the harsh, unforgiving light, completely exposed to the one person he thought he could easily manipulate. He opened his mouth to stammer a pathetic, improvised excuse, to frantically weave another layer of complex lies, but she instantly silenced him with a single, authoritative raise of her hand. She didn't want his empty apologies, and she certainly didn't care about his desperate corporate spin. She looked at him through those dark, impenetrable sunglasses and made a counteroffer that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both their lives forever. She calmly stated that her private equity fund was entirely prepared to inject the exact, massive amount of capital his crumbling empire required to survive. In fact, she offered him 20% more than he had initially greedily asked for, a sum that would not only stabilize his current, terrifying cash bleed, but would theoretically allow him to aggressively expand and completely crush his remaining market competitors. For a brief, intoxicating second, his eyes lit up with the blinding, insatiable greed of a starving man suddenly handed a feast. But then, with the lethal precision of a highly trained assassin, she smoothly delivered the devastating condition. This massive financial rescue would not be a standard, passive investment, and it certainly wouldn't involve the pathetic, non-voting minority stake he had arrogantly proposed. The absolute, non-negotiable collateral for this colossal loan would be the complete transfer of his personal, majority voting shares in the holding company held in a strict legal escrow. If he missed a single, highly rigid repayment, or if the company's aggressive revenue targets fell even a fraction of a percent below the impossible metrics outlined in her terms, the escrow would instantly dissolve, and absolute, unquestionable ownership of his entire empire would legally transfer to her fund. It was the ultimate, terrifying Faustian bargain, laid out beautifully on pristine, watermarked legal paper. To a rational, healthy mind, the extreme danger of this arrangement would have been instantly, glaringly obvious. It was a blatant, highly aggressive corporate trap designed specifically to strip him of his life's work. But you have to profoundly understand the severely distorted mindset of a deeply narcissistic man who was actively drowning in his own catastrophic failures. He was no longer thinking like a brilliant, visionary CEO. He was acting entirely out of raw, blinding desperation and a terrifying fear of public humiliation. The profound impact of losing his shiny social status, of having his wealthy peers and his young, demanding new girlfriend discover that he was secretly broke, was a fate far worse to him than signing a high-risk financial document. His massive, fragile ego instantly began to aggressively rationalize the terrifying terms. He silently convinced himself that he was a generational business genius, that the upcoming quarter would miraculously turn around, and that he could easily outsmart this cold, foreign investor once the desperately needed cash was safely deposited into his accounts. He viewed her strict, unforgiving terms not as a lethal threat, but merely as a temporary, annoying hurdle he would inevitably jump over. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the psychology behind these monumental, catastrophic decisions is an absolute masterclass in human delusion. The incredible journey from absolute power to total, irreversible ruin rarely happens because of external market forces. It almost always happens because a person's arrogant mind fundamentally refuses to accept the reality of their own glaring vulnerabilities. We often look behind the scenes of massive corporate collapses and assume there must have been some complex, unavoidable disaster. But the staggering revelations usually point to moments exactly like this one: a desperate, highly insecure individual willingly putting their head directly into the lion's mouth, utterly convinced they can miraculously tame the beast before it bites down. The sheer, terrifying audacity it takes to completely blind yourself to the obvious danger right in front of you is a testament to the destructive power of unchecked narcissism. He was so intensely focused on maintaining the hollow, glittering facade of his success that he completely ignored the massive, highly strategic foundation she had been silently building specifically to destroy him. With a swift, almost elegant motion, her executive assistant placed the thick, imposing leather-bound contract directly in front of him on the dark table, along with an incredibly heavy, expensive fountain pen. This was the document that contained the highly sophisticated, incredibly cruel fine print she had spent grueling sleepless months meticulously crafting with her team of ruthless international lawyers. Buried deep within those dozens of dense, impenetrable pages of complex legal jargon were highly specific trigger clauses, accelerated repayment demands, and cross-default provisions that essentially guaranteed he would violently fail. It was an absolute masterpiece of financial warfare, a flawless, perfectly executed trap disguised as a golden parachute. A wise man would have called his entire legal team, demanded a grueling, week-long review of every single comma, and fought aggressively over every single clause. But he didn't. He picked up the heavy gold pen, his hands visibly shaking, not from fear or hesitation, but from the raw, intoxicating adrenaline of having supposedly secured his salvation. She watched him in absolute, breathless silence. Underneath the dark, expensive sunglasses, her heart was pounding a frantic, victorious rhythm against her ribs. This was the precise culmination of her entire transformation, the absolute zenith of her silent, agonizing pain turned into a lethal weapon. She didn't blink. She didn't offer a single word of reassurance. She simply sat there, radiating an aura of terrifying, untouchable power, while he foolishly, arrogantly signed away the very empire he had built on her invisible, broken back. The scratching sound of the metal pen against the thick paper echoed loudly in the silent room, sounding exactly like the heavy, final lock of a prison cell clicking permanently into place. He aggressively scrawled his signature on the final page, let out a massive, highly theatrical sigh of relief, and slid the heavy document back across the table, flashing her that same, pathetic, arrogant smile, entirely convinced he had just brilliantly won the ultimate game. He had absolutely no idea that the ink he just used had permanently sealed his spectacular doom, and that the terrifying, glorious consequences of his blind greed were already beginning to violently unfold, exactly as she had perfectly engineered. Comment down below. He signed his own downfall. The ink on that heavy, highly restrictive contract was barely dry before the devastating reality of his catastrophic decisions began to violently manifest in the real world. Within mere weeks, the highly complex, meticulously crafted trigger clauses she had embedded deep within the document activated with ruthless, mathematical precision. It started with a single missed revenue target, a massively aggressive metric she knew from her intimate knowledge of his operations was completely impossible for his bleeding company to ever hit. Then came the accelerated repayment demand, a massive, crushing financial blow he was entirely unprepared for. The behind-the-scenes panic and his luxurious corporate headquarters devolved into absolute, terrifying chaos. The young, glamorous new partner had already quietly packed her expensive designer bags and fled the moment the company credit card started declining, leaving him entirely alone in his crumbling, isolating ivory tower. Desperate, deeply humiliated, and backed into a terrifying legal corner, he was forcefully compelled to call an emergency meeting of his board of directors, desperately hoping to somehow renegotiate the lethal terms he had so arrogantly and blindly signed. When the heavy oak doors of the grand boardroom swung open that morning, the atmosphere was incredibly tense and suffocating. The remaining board members sat in heavy, judgmental silence, their faces pale and angry, watching the empire they had invested in rapidly disintegrate. He stood at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, sweating profusely, nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, desperately rehearsing yet another pathetic string of corporate lies to save his own skin. But the precise second the heavy doors opened again to admit the majority debt holder, the entire room completely froze. She walked into the imposing boardroom not as a frantic, angry ex-wife seeking petty revenge, but as the absolute, undisputed owner of his entire existence. The profound physical and psychological transformation she had undergone over her incredible journey was now radiating an aura of untouchable, terrifying authority that instantly dominated the space. She wore a flawlessly tailored, dark charcoal power suit, her posture impeccable and unyielding. The heavy designer sunglasses still firmly in place, acting as an impenetrable, intimidating shield. The highly aggressive corporate lawyers flanked her, carrying the thick, leather-bound briefcases that contained the definitive, indisputable legal proof of his absolute ruin. As she slowly and deliberately took her seat at the opposite end of the long table, directly facing the sweating man who had callously thrown her away like garbage, the sheer, heavy impact of the moment hung thick in the freezing, air-conditioned air. Driven by pure, blinding panic, he immediately launched into his desperate, pathetic routine, using his deepest, most persuasive executive voice, profusely apologizing for the temporary, unforeseen market fluctuations and aggressively begging for a brief, merciful extension on the loan terms. He desperately tried to charm her. He tried to manipulate her, still operating under the pathetic, deeply ingrained delusion that his raw charisma could somehow magically fix the massive, gaping holes in his sinking ship. She let him speak for a full 3 minutes. She silently let him thoroughly embarrass himself in front of his esteemed board of directors, watching him squirm, stutter, and beg, completely stripping away the very last remaining shreds of his fragile, inflated dignity. And then, with a single, highly deliberate raise of her manicured hand, she instantly silenced the entire room. The heavy, European-accented baritone she had meticulously maintained for months was suddenly, completely gone. When she finally spoke, her voice was crystal clear, undeniably familiar, and terrifyingly calm. "There will be absolutely no extensions," she stated coldly, the natural, unmasked cadence of her true voice echoing loudly against the thick glass walls. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, the escrow account has officially dissolved due to multiple, catastrophic breaches of contract. I am no longer your investor. I am now the majority shareholder, and I am the new chief executive officer of this company." The board members gasped in collective, genuine shock, but the ex-husband simply froze, his face violently draining of all color. His arrogant brain completely short-circuited as he desperately tried to process the impossible, horrifying familiarity of that specific voice. Slowly, with deliberate, agonizing precision, she reached up and finally removed the heavy, dark designer sunglasses. She looked him dead in the deeply terrified eyes, stripping away the absolute final layer of her brilliant disguise. The devastating truth of her identity hit him like a massive, physical blow to the chest. The profound revelations of his own spectacular failure completely washed over him as he stared into the cold, unyielding eyes of the very woman he had brutally discarded, completely underestimated, and confidently called useless. The look of pure, unadulterated terror and absolute humiliation that violently contorted his face. And that precise moment was the ultimate, breathtaking reward for every single tear she had ever shed in that cheap, dingy motel room. He literally stumbled backward, his knees visibly shaking against the mahogany table, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single, coherent sound. His entire, carefully curated reality violently shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of the silent, watching board. The hidden truth was finally exposed for everyone in the industry to see. The supposed visionary business genius had been flawlessly, brutally outsmarted, entirely outmaneuvered, and financially destroyed by the invisible, devoted wife he truly thought lacked the basic mental capacity to understand a simple spreadsheet. She didn't scream, she didn't gloat, and she didn't throw his past cruelties in his face. Her absolute, deafening success and her flawless execution were the most violent, destructive revenge she could have ever possibly orchestrated. She simply sat at the head of the massive boardroom table, a true queen rightfully reclaiming her stolen throne, watching the pathetic, broken man who had once tried to completely erase her existence now desperately hyperventilate, as the ruthless security guards were quietly called to physically escort him out of the very building he used to arrogantly own. The sheer magnitude of this psychological victory was a beautiful testament to the incredible, unstoppable power of a woman who decides to entirely weaponize her own profound pain, instead of letting it quietly consume her. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the complex psychology of this specific type of victory is absolutely crucial for anyone actively navigating their own path out of a deeply toxic, abusive dynamic. What you are witnessing in this breathtaking climax is not just a standard tale of financial retribution or a lucky twist of fate. It is a profound masterclass in the complete, radical restructuring of a human mindset. When someone violently betrays you, especially someone you implicitly trusted with your entire life and future, the deepest, most agonizing wound isn't just the physical abandonment or the loss of the relationship. It is the aggressive, intentional theft of your personal agency. They leave you feeling completely powerless, entirely dependent on their twisted, self-serving narrative to define your worth. The only possible way to permanently cure that specific type of agonizing trauma is to actively, ruthlessly take your power back on a scale so massive that it permanently rewires your own brain. Her incredible decisions throughout this entire, grueling process were never truly about him. They were entirely about proving her own limitless, terrifying capabilities to herself. By mastering his highly complex industry, by brilliantly outsmarting his entire, expensive legal team, and by flawlessly executing an incredibly sophisticated corporate takeover, she completely and permanently dismantled the toxic, limiting beliefs he had violently forced upon her for over a decade. She didn't just passively survive the brutal fire he maliciously set to her life. She actively absorbed its intense heat, transformed it into pure, blinding energy, and used it to forge an entirely new, indestructible reality where she dictates all the rules. This is the absolute core of true empowerment. It isn't about simply proving the abusers wrong in a petty argument. It is about permanently elevating yourself to a highly advanced level of existence, where their pathetic opinions, their cruel words, and their massive egos absolutely no longer matter to your daily peace. You become an entirely different species of human being, operating on a frequency they cannot even begin to comprehend or reach. And as she sat comfortably in that luxurious leather chair, watching the heavy boardroom doors close firmly behind his retreating, entirely defeated figure, effectively erasing him from her magnificent new empire, she felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute clarity settling into her bones. Write in the comments, "I am claiming my victory." The heavy, imposing oak doors of the grand boardroom clicked firmly shut, and with that single, echoing sound, his entire majestic empire was officially, permanently erased from his trembling grasp. The man who had once strutted arrogantly through those sparkling glass halls, radiating blinding narcissism and demanding absolute submission from everyone around him, found himself standing alone on the cold, unforgiving concrete sidewalk outside. He was clutching a small, pathetic cardboard box containing a few meaningless personal desk items, shivering in his expensive, bespoke suit as the terrifying reality of his total annihilation finally began to sink in. His rapid, violent descent into absolute ruin wasn't just a quiet, private financial failure. It was a profound, highly publicized social execution. The wealthy, elite peers who used to laugh loudly at his terrible jokes and eagerly drink his expensive vintage champagne suddenly stopped returning his desperate phone calls. His glamorous, young new girlfriend, realizing with absolute horror that the limitless corporate credit cards had violently evaporated, and the private jets were permanently grounded, vanished into thin air faster than his arrogant mind could even process the loss. Stripped of his massive wealth, his stolen company, and his fabricated social standing, he was forcefully relegated to a tiny, rundown, depressing apartment on the absolute outskirts of the city. It was an environment eerily and poetically similar to the exact cheap, dingy motel where he had cruelly exiled his ex-wife to suffer alone just a few short years prior. The delicious, devastating irony of his new, pathetic reality was an absolute masterclass in poetic justice. Every single morning, he was forced to wake up in that cramped, lonely room, open the financial papers, and read the glowing, front-page headlines detailing the meteoric, unstoppable, and breathtaking rise of the very company he had completely driven into the ground, now being flawlessly and brilliantly managed by the very woman he had so foolishly and confidently deemed useless inside the walls of that massive corporation. She didn't just sit comfortably on her newly reclaimed throne and passively maintain the fragile status quo. She initiated a massive, unprecedented, and aggressive corporate revolution when she officially took the helm as the undisputed majority owner and CEO. The true behind-the-scenes reality of the organization was profoundly bleak. The employee morale was entirely shattered, the accounts were bleeding millions, and the highly toxic, fear-based culture he had selfishly fostered for a decade was actively poisoning everything it touched. But she seamlessly applied the exact same meticulous, unbreakable focus and ironclad discipline she had utilized during her own personal transformation to completely resurrect the dying business. She didn't hesitate for a single second. Her first crucial decisions involved immediately and publicly firing the sycophantic, grossly incompetent executives who had blindly enabled his reckless, ego-driven behavior. She systematically replaced them with brilliant, diverse, and highly capable minds who actually understood the market. She swiftly implemented brilliant, highly sustainable operational strategies that instantly stabilized the massive, suffocating debt he had carelessly accumulated. Within the very first year of her fierce, unyielding tenure, she didn't just miraculously save the company from the absolute brink of catastrophic bankruptcy. She aggressively expanded its global reach into highly lucrative, untapped international markets. Fast forward a few short years, and she had successfully, undeniably grown the enterprise to 10 times its original, fragile size. She completely redefined the profound impact the corporation had on the entire global industry, effectively turning a failing, extremely fragile ego-driven vanity project into an unshakable, terrifyingly powerful international financial juggernaut. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the true, lasting, and deeply resonant power of this incredible story isn't just about a satisfying, cinematic corporate revenge plot. It is fundamentally about the monumental, life-altering decisions we are violently forced to make when we find ourselves completely shattered, abandoned, and bleeding on the floor. The hidden truth about genuine, unshakable empowerment is that it absolutely requires a profound, often excruciatingly painful shift in your core mindset. You see, the easiest, most natural thing in the world is to remain permanently broken. It is incredibly easy to let a deep, traumatic betrayal permanently define your entire future, to wear your deep victimhood like a heavy, comforting, and familiar blanket. But her phenomenal, breathtaking journey emphatically proves that the deepest, most agonizing psychological wounds can miraculously become the highly fertile, nutrient-rich soil for the most extraordinary, unprecedented personal growth. The profound revelation she experienced during those dark, isolated, and weeping nights in her tiny studio apartment fundamentally and permanently rewired her entire brain chemistry. She realized, with blinding, absolute clarity, that the immense emotional energy required to actively hate him and seek petty vengeance was entirely wasted. Instead, she took all of that burning, chaotic, highly combustible emotional energy and meticulously, ruthlessly channeled it entirely into her own absolute, terrifying excellence. She didn't aggressively rebuild herself simply to show him exactly what he missed out on. She meticulously rebuilt herself to finally meet and embrace the magnificent, unimaginably powerful woman she was always fundamentally destined to become. This brings us to the absolute, undeniable, and universally terrifying law of the universe that every single toxic, deeply arrogant person eventually learns the hard way. Never, under any circumstances, underestimate the terrifying, completely unstoppable rebuilding capacity of a woman who has had her heart violently broken. When you aggressively and callously strip away absolutely everything a devoted person loves, when you violently push them into a dark corner and maliciously try to extinguish their very soul, you are not permanently destroying them. You are aggressively, permanently burning away absolutely all of their remaining fears. You are actively leaving them with absolutely nothing left to lose, which instantly, fundamentally makes them the most highly dangerous, lethal, and completely unstoppable force of nature on the face of the earth. She took the broken, shattered, jagged glass of her completely ruined life and she patiently, meticulously, and brilliantly glued it all back together into a magnificent, razor-sharp, and absolutely lethal crown. She sits securely on that massive corporate throne today not as a bitter, traumatized ex-wife obsessing over the past, but as a universally respected, fiercely independent, and profoundly intimidating titan of industry who instantly commands absolute, unquestionable authority the very second she walks into any room in the world. Her monumental, deafening success is the absolute ultimate, permanent silencer to every single cruel lie he ever dared to tell her about her own inherent worth. But to truly sustain this unimaginable level of massive, towering success, and to fiercely protect this newly built, sprawling empire from any future internal or external threats, the profound internal psychological work absolutely does not stop at the glorious victory lap. Reclaiming your stolen power and publicly destroying your abusers is truly only the very first major milestone in a lifelong trajectory of excellence. Actively, aggressively defending that immense power against the entirely new, highly sophisticated challenges that constantly arise at the top requires an entirely different, highly advanced set of psychological and strategic tools. We absolutely have to look closely at the daily, invisible, highly disciplined habits that keep this kind of fierce, unshakable, and terrifyingly calm energy completely intact long after the initial, bloody battle has been decisively won, because the complex, delicate architecture of maintaining your heavy crown is just as demanding and critical as the brutal, agonizing war you successfully fought to win it in the first place? Write in the comments, I am building my own empire. Maintaining the crown and protecting your new reality requires constant self-awareness. And that is exactly why we are building this safe space together. If this story resonated with your own personal journey, inspired you in some way, or simply brought a little bit of clarity to whatever phase of life you are currently navigating, I would love to invite you to subscribe to the channel. My goal here is precisely that, to bring you content that goes far beyond just a good story, delivering real reflections and practical tools for you to apply to your own daily reconstruction. And since you walk with me all the way to the very end of today's journey, let me know that we are truly connected on this exact same frequency. Drop a comment down below saying, I'm with you till the end. I genuinely read and deeply value everyone who stays for every single detail of our conversations. Take this quick moment to leave a like on the video as well. It is a very simple, natural way to show that our exchange today made sense and actually brought some real value to your day. Your journey of empowerment certainly doesn't stop here. And to help you further bulletproof this powerful new mindset we are building, there is a video right over here on the screen that perfectly complements this exact subject. Click on it and continue with me over there, because our next conversation is already waiting for you.